All right, I think everybody who is joining us remotely is in the room. Thank you so much, folks who are in the room here in presence, and also those folks who are joining us remotely. My name is Mark Loudon. I'm the director of the Max Kade Institute for German American Studies here at UW-Madison, and we're very pleased to inaugurate our first hybrid lecture. We've done in-person lectures, we've done virtual lectures throughout the pandemic, and now we're trying something in the middle here, where we're incorporating both in-person folks as well as folks at home. Very, very pleased to welcome Aaron Spencer Fogleman. Aaron is a distinguished research professor in history, the Department of History at Northern Illinois University. He teaches undergraduate courses and graduate seminars in early American history and the history of the Atlantic world, as well as methodology courses and independent studies by both undergraduate and graduate students. He's the author of numerous publications, hence his distinguished research status at NIU. One book that I have drawn on with much profit over the years is Hopeful Journeys, German Immigration, Settlement, and Political Culture in Colonial America, 1717 to 1775, which appeared in 1996. Next book that appeared in 2007, Jesus is Female, Moravians and Radical Religion in Early America. And then somewhat more recently in 2013, Two Troubled Souls, an 18th century couple's spiritual journey in the Atlantic world. And currently he's at work on two book projects. One is a monograph that's entitled Immigrant Voices, European and African Stories of Freedom, Unfreedom, and Identity Through Four Generations of Transatlantic Migrations to the Americas. And the research for that was funded through a Guggenheim Foundation research fellowship. And the second monograph that Professor Fogleman is working on is 500 African Voices, a catalog of published accounts by Africans enslaved in the transatlantic slave trade from 1586 to 1936. I believe some of that material will be some that he's sharing with us this evening. The title of his presentation is African Voices in German Language Publications, Slave Ship Survivors in the Atlantic World, 1739 to 1932. Thank you very much, and joining me in welcoming Professor Fogleman.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you for coming. I've been looking forward to this for a long time. This is my first in-person presentation in quite a while. And it's just nice to go someplace and meet people and do this live. But for those of you who are tuning in on Zoom, glad you're here as well. And I'm going to talk for a few minutes about this project, and I'll be happy to answer as many questions as you might have. You will not be able to wear me out with questions. I can promise you that. Okay, so I'm going to start with an anecdote, and then I'll explain more about what this is all about. It begins with a man named Oppo Dobendo Uma. And I'll tell you right now that African languages are not my forte, and I have a trick for this that works. If it's a faraway different language, I pronounce it like it's in German. And 9 times out of 10, you get pretty close. Now, I'm not going to say Woma, I'll say Woma. But at work, English, oh, it's a terrible language for the pronunciation for other world languages. It just doesn't work. I don't know why that is. So that's what I'll try to do, but I'm not pretending to master African languages. So in 1769, this enslaved West African named Oppo Dobendo Uma, who was also known as Andrew the Moor, was in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. He told his life story to a German Moravian missionary named Christian Georg Andreas Oldendorp. And this was as Oldendorp was passing through Pennsylvania on his way back to Germany. He had been in the Danish West Indies, where the Moravians had a very successful missionary outpost, and they were working with enslaved Africans and African-born and Creole peoples there, and what is now the U.S. Virgin Islands. So he's going back home and he stops at this Moravian settlement in Bethlehem. When he was in the Caribbean, he recorded 81 accounts by African slave ship survivors on the island. He interviewed them. Tell me about yourself. Where you come from in Africa? What was it like? How did you get captured? How did you get over here? How are you living here? Tell me about your religion. Tell me about your language. It's the ethnography. And he was putting together this material to write a history of the Caribbean mission, which he eventually did. Now, Woma, identified as Igbo in modern southeastern Nigeria, and he came from a place that he called Alo, which we think may have been the town of Edo or Alo. But it was in a large country deep in the interior. When he was about 8 years old, his father died, and his half-brother sent him to another man to live and work as a servant for 2 years. In the late 1730s, when he was about 12 years old, his half-brother sold him into slavery. The new owners took him on a long journey to the sea, and he encountered many, many different peoples whose customs he describes in the peoples. It's very interesting to get this perspective on the people living there then. There, European slave traders sold him to an English slave ship, which took him to the British colony of Antigua in the Caribbean. In about 1741, he was taken to New York, and that's where a German Moravian missionary found him contemplating suicide because he was so unhappy, and he purchased him. By 1745, Woma had embraced Moravian Christianity and was taken to the mostly German settlement of Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, where he lived enslaved the rest of his life. In 1762, he married Magdalena Boyle Brockend, a freed Moravian woman, and together they had 3 children. He died in Bethlehem in 1779. Meanwhile, Oldendorp returned to Germany in 1769, and he published his history of the mission in the Danish West Indies in 1777 in abridged form. But fortunately, it includes all of Woma's story. It was published in Barbie and Leipzig in the original German. And then his book was published in Swedish in Stockholm in 1786, and then again in 1788. And then 2 centuries later, it was first published in English translation in Ann Arbor in 1987. A few years later, in 1995, in Hildesheim, Germany, a photomechanical reprint of the 1777 edition appeared. And then in Philadelphia in 1988, Woma's manuscript memoir, or Lebenslauf, was published in English translation. The Moravians do that late in life. Someone records your life story, Lebenslauf, and they keep them in archives, and a few of them have been published. His was published in English translation, 1988. And this adds further detail to his life story in his own voice. You're getting the African voice here through that, and that's what's important. Finally, a full unabridged version of Oldendorp's history of the mission appeared in a German edition in the years 2000 to 2002 in Berlin. 4 big, thick volumes. Woma's account is among those of the 81 African slave ship founders that I found in this 3,000-page multi-volume edition. So Woma's story of freedom, lost in West Africa, and enslavement in the Americas was available to those reading German or Swedish since the late 18th century, and additionally, since the late 20th century, to those reading English and up until today. So this is part of this larger project that I'm working on. And this is going to come out really soon. The book, 500 African Voices, a catalog of published accounts by Africans enslaved in the transatlantic slave trade. Co-editor is Robert Hanserd. He's a doctoral student of mine at Northern Illinois University. He now teaches at Columbia College in Chicago, but he is a specialist on the Africanist side and has really helped with that. This is coming out very soon. They're telling me it will be calendar year 2022. So soon. But that's what the cover looks like anyway. So it's one of nearly 500 accounts by slave ship survivors. These are people born free in Africa who tell about some aspect of their lives before, during, or after the Middle Passage in a recognizable African voice. And it was published sooner or later. Sometimes it's right in the day during slavery. Sometimes it's a modern scholar that discovers it, the manuscript, and publishes it. And my project, with the help of others, has been to put this out in a print edition, which the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia is doing. And then we're going to follow this with a website that will put all of this information and more there, and it will be linked with many other websites on the history of transatlantic slavery. So today I want to talk about the Germans who were involved, their language, and its role in publishing these accounts in the Atlantic world. And then I want to talk about the Africans themselves in these German language accounts. So for the Germans, there are almost 500 discrete entries in all languages in this catalog. We do the whole Atlantic world, all the continents. It's for people who were taken in the transatlantic slave trade to wherever. The vast majority are taken to the Americas, a small number are taken to Europe, and many are intercepted at sea and taken back to Africa, but to some other place, usually Sierra Leone. There are more than 2,500 printings that we've cataloged of the 500 discrete entries. There's a large number and variety of languages are involved, geographic distribution throughout the Atlantic world. And that's the contribution of the project, to put it all together for everyone who would be interested. Most slavery scholars would tell you that there are less than 20 such accounts available, but we've got 500 now. And the largest non-English language in the collection is German. So I began to notice that 2 or 3 years ago, and I thought this could interest people who work in German studies, and this is my first time to actually talk about it, the German aspect of it. So I'll be curious as to your thoughts on that. I've been talking about the project altogether and many other places, but this aspect is new. The German publications were produced primarily by missionaries, scientists, modern scholars, and printers. So I want to run through some examples of these, and I'm going to give you a few case studies later of the Africans themselves. So the majority of the missionaries involved were Moravians. And I don't know how familiar you are with this group, but just it's a Protestant, mostly German Protestant evangelical group that was taken off in the 18th century and had a huge global mission movement. For their numbers of the entire group centered primarily in Germany, the missionary efforts were, quite frankly, incredible. Okay, the most important of these I mentioned earlier was Oldendorp, and he published his history of the mission in the Danish West Indies. Well, first let me say the mission began in the 1730s, and we're talking about the islands of, I'll just say in English, St. Thomas, St. Croix, and St. John, because they're U.S. Virgin Islands now. But he was there 1767 to 68. The mission began a generation before, and he interviewed many people. I'm just focusing on the 81 Africans, but many others, a couple of hundred people. They just sit down at a campfire or something on the plantation where the mission was, if they were interested in Christianity. Many were, most were not, but many were. And they would just ask him these questions. He recorded the answers in just thousands of pages of manuscripts in German. So the full edition, the recent one from Berlin from about 20 years ago, has the 81 voices that I have in the catalog. They describe their homelands in Africa, anywhere from Congo to Senegal and the back countries of all those areas. Life and freedom there, how they were enslaved, the passage to the Danish West Indies, life there altogether, and what was going on in the Moravian mission where they participated. If they were Africans and others as well, if they'd been there for very long and were connected to the mission, they spoke at least some German. That's just what you did when you participated in these missions, some more than others. The main efforts were concentrated on this plantation called Neuherrnhut on St. Thomas. That's an 18th century engraving of it. So the people who would come there for the Christian worship were learning some German, but the lingua franca of the islands was actually Dutch. It wasn't even Danish, because of Dutch planters were moving in. They're still under Danish colonial authority, but you spoke Dutch if you wanted to get anywhere with the authorities. There were other Moravian missions in Suriname and in Jamaica in the 18th and 19th century, and I found numerous African accounts in those records as well. And they weren't all Moravians, though. There were the Basel Mission. I need to get rid of that so people can read all the headings. How should I do that best? Okay. All right, thank you. So this is the Basel Mission in Accra, which is in modern Ghana. It's on the West African coast there. This was a joint Lutheran and Calvinist mission that centered in Accra that was begun in 1815. It's still there, by the way. And they had numerous publications from the period. They have their archives in Basel, Switzerland, and there's a lot of material that I found there. So those are the missionaries and their contributions. Next are the scientists. The first I want to look at is a man named Sigismund Wilhelm Köhler. See his dates there. He was a linguist and a missionary. He was from Claiborne, Württemberg. He trained in the Basel Mission and then worked actually for the English Church Missionary Society. So his publications are in English, including the big one here, the Polyglata Africana. And this came out in London in 1854, and I found 60 African voices in this. He went to Sierra Leone, where so many people who had been in the transatlantic slave trade when it was illegal, the British Navy was patrolling the Atlantic trying to stop the illegal transatlantic slave trade. And if they caught a slave ship, they would liberate the people in the holds below in chains and take them to Sierra Leone. They didn't take them back to wherever they came from. And this was a British colony. And they would work. They were forced to work, actually, for a few years. It was kind of a status of semi-freedom, essentially like indentured servants for a few years. And then they were fully free legally after that. But they just stayed there. So what you had in Sierra Leone was kind of a melting pot of Africans and their languages. So if you're a linguist like Kola, what better place to go to study African languages? Just about all of them, or at least in Atlantic Africa. And that's what he did. He stayed there for a long time. He just talked to everybody and he wanted to record their story. Where did you come from? What happened to you? And he was especially interested in the language issues. And I should have given you an example of this. This guy, it took me a moment when I first was reading this to grasp what he was doing. You have never seen so many diacritical markings in language ever. I mean, you know, we know umlauts and the grave and agu accents and things, but European languages, you're familiar with that. It goes way beyond that. This guy would put 2 or 3 different diacritical marks on one letter. Try to get Microsoft Word or WordPerfect to reproduce that for you. Man, that's tough. I could get maybe 3/4 of them. And I just thought, what is he doing? And nobody else does that. And it dawned me, the guy's a linguist. I mean, he was a missionary, but you could tell he's first and foremost a scientist, a linguist. That's what he's doing there. He's not there to promote the gospel, but he was connected to a missionary society. And just the most, and he's just making it up. Nobody in the world could do this. He's the first one to give it a shot in the 1850s. And I have no idea how to pronounce. Like I said, I just do it in German for the most part and hope that I'm close. And I do have West African graduate students that more or less nod in approval and say, yeah, you're in the ballpark when I do it that way. But that was Kola. Another one was Carl Witte, the Berlin geography professor. I mentioned him earlier to Eva. You see his dates there. He collaborated with a man named Franz Hugo Hesse, who was the Prussian general consul in Havana, Cuba. And I don't think I have a picture of him, no. But Hesse lived in Cuba and talked to people of all sorts, enslaved people. And you know, I go through all that and focus on the people who were born in Africa, who were on a slave ship. So those are the accounts that I pull out. And he told them their stories, and Hesse sent it back to Berlin to Ritter, and he published it in German in the Monatsberichte über die Verhandlungen der Gesellschaft für Erdkunde zu Berlin. And I don't know if that society still exists. I'm sure it either does or some descendant of it must still exist there. I've got to look that up. So Hesse spoke to them in Cuba in 1852. Nobody there is going to speak German. It's just not going to happen. I don't know if he translated it or if Ritter translated it. But one of the two did, and Ritter was responsible for getting it published in this geography journal in 1853. Okay. There are also modern scholars involved. Guttorm Meyer published She's the one who published Oldendorf's complete 3,000-page manuscript 20 years ago in Benin. And then Christian Dane did a study of a merchant family in 1974, and there's an account in there. And then Paul Lovejoy, the famous Africanist in Toronto, did a 2011 article on a woman named Gave she was in the Basel Mission. I'm going to come to her later. And he actually published the article in French, but he included the German manuscript of her account. So you get to see that in the original language. So it meets the criteria for cataloging there. So it's just, for the modern scholars, there's some nice larger collections, but a lot of it just comes from hither, thither, and yon. Somebody publishes something that's in an African voice, and a few of them are in German. Okay, the printers. The print history is really interesting. These are the first printings, so the first edition, if you will, of these accounts. And these are the non-English versions. And you can see they're more German than Spanish. You can also see a problem with Portuguese. This is Brazil, where so many Africans were taken, and they're vastly underrepresented there. That's just the nature of the publishing history of it. But yeah, German was the highest. Subsequent printings after the first edition, I include that as well. These are translations. So maybe the first one appeared in English in 1830, and then 5 years later, or even 50 years later, somebody publishes a German translation. There are a lot of those. Again, there's 2,500 total editions in the collection, but German was the highest of the non-English languages. And back to the first printings, if you want to see where they appeared and some dates and the printers, there you go. Starts in 1741. Last one I found, there'll be more in the future, was 2011. Here's a map of the first printings. These are the locations of the subsequent printings in German, and this is just very simple. This gets large and complicated, and I haven't worked out all the map work for that yet, but just to give you an idea. Probably includes a couple of places you've never heard of, but many of them will be familiar to you. Okay, so that's what I have for sort of the Germans themselves and their contributions. But I want to focus the rest of the time on the Africans who provided all of these accounts that were published in German. And this is just a small number of the images. One of the things I like about this project is when you start looking, you find images of a lot of these people. If you came early, you may have seen the rolling slide display of people in the catalog, and I think I had about 50 of them there, and I would have had more, but I just had to stop. And I will be able to collect more in the future. But if you start looking, you can find out a lot about these people. That's the idea. And you even start getting photographs in the later period, and even film, moving pictures of a couple of them. That's when you get into to the 20th century. That's pretty cool. Okay, so yeah, about half of the 500 voices were published in in German or in German translation in first or subsequent editions. Some Africans in the first editions spoke German to the mediator, some did not. So I want to look at their stories, who these people were, because they're just amazing testimonies to the struggles, the resistance, the accomplishments, the failures of people who, born free in Africa, endured the slave ship experience and slavery in the Americas. And a lot of it is just about, it's just living. How did people live through this? And they tell you about it. And they love to talk about languages, especially the languages they spoke at home, and the long trek from wherever they were captured to the coast, to the slave ship. And the linguists like Kola, they just ate this up, just put all of it into their accounts, because that's what they wanted to know, the language, the geography of Africa. And they would go to places like Sierra Leone or to Brazil to interview people, because before about the 1850s, before the second half of the 19th century, it wasn't very safe for most Europeans to go to these places and really talk to people, because the European political, military, economic incursions were rather limited and on the coastlines in most places. So you go to Brazil to talk to them, or to Cuba, or to Sierra Leone. And that's the first thing they're interested in. Is tell me about the place, the people, the cultures, and the languages. So looking at all these testimonies makes it clear that there's just no one way to understand life in slavery or the slave ship experience, or any African experiences within that. Each African, and there are 12.5 million taken into the slave trade, all told, that each African taken on a slave ship was unique, and they each had a story to tell. So I'm going to give you a few other examples beyond Uma that appeared in published form in German that circulated in the Atlantic world back in the day, and they still do. The first of these is a woman named Dama, and I put the African name first, and then they pick up European names, sometimes more than one, after they're taken into slavery. She was remarkable. You see her dates there. Remarkable for writing a petition in her first language, which was Aya Azitzo, and Dutch Creole. She probably knew some German. Her son was fluent in German, but she didn't know German well enough to write, and she's writing to the Danish queen, so you wouldn't write to her in German anyway. But she was from Grand Popo, the Popo Hula Kingdom's political trade center. It was a port town in West Africa. She and her family embraced Roman Catholicism before they were taken into slavery. They converted after contact with Capuchin missionaries in the 1660s. She was baptized and grew up learning to read and write Aya Aitzo and perhaps Portuguese. Her owner, in the 1690s, she was sold during civil wars taking place in the area and taken to St. Thomas in the Caribbean. Her owner freed her in the early 1730s, probably because she was so old, in her 80s. By then, she was also literate in Dutch Creole. In 1736, she converted to the Protestant Moravians and became an eldress in their new St. Thomas mission. And she acted as a spokesperson for the mission with the Danish authorities. In 1739, she sent this petition to the Danish queen, claiming to write on behalf of 250 enslaved women. She described worship where she came from in Popo and life there before she converted to Christianity. And she explained that the planters on St. Thomas were preventing other people from receiving Christian instruction from the Moravians or anybody else, but the main present was Moravians. So she was writing to the Queen to ask her to intercede with the king on their behalf so that the missions could be open to everybody. There's a long publication history of Dama's voice. It began in Leipzig, and the publisher was David Cotta in 1741. He published it again in 1742, another edition. Then it came out in English translation in Boston the next year in 1743, and again in 1744, then Edinburgh, Scotland in 1744, and then in Basel and Leipzig in Germany, and a generation later in 1777. Then there was a 2-century gap, after which the modern scholars took over. It came out in Hildesheim, 1964, 1995, Neumünster in 1974 and 84 and 2000, Ann Arbor in 1987. It goes on. The last edition is Philadelphia in 2018. So in short, this African woman's voice circulated in Europe and North America in numerous languages, including German in the 18th century, for anybody who was interested in what was going on in the Christian mission in the Caribbean, and then more recently among scholars. Okay. Oh, there's the partition itself. Sorry, I meant to show you that. That's in Dutch Creole. Okay. Now, the next example is an unnamed Tembu or Temba woman. And she talked to Oldendorp as well, on St. Thomas. And she was from what is now Togo, northern Togo, West Africa. And she described how in her homeland, in every village, people were worried at nights about the threats of attack and kidnapping and being sold into slavery. The Asante especially targeted Tembu children. They gagged them and carried them away in sacks. This woman was the daughter of the governor in her territory. And while her father was away fighting the Asante, her village wasn't attacked. They killed her brother and cut off her sister's hand to remove the gold bands from her arm. They would have done the same to this woman, but she had a pox, she described it. So they carried her and her sister and others away. They had already killed her brother. And the Asante refused her father's ransom payments to try to get her back. He offered 12 slaves in exchange to get his daughter back. But they wouldn't do it. Most of the prisoners they took were killed, but her life was spared because an Asante girl wanted her for her servant. Later, they were taken to a fort, sold, and then taken on a slave ship to the Danish West Indies. That's where she spoke to Oldendorp. So this is one of many accounts describing what it was like to be attacked in a village and just overwhelmed in warfare, essentially, and then enslaved and taken to a slave ship. So imagine what it was like from Oldendorp's perspective, the missionary who recorded all this, to sit around an evening campfire and listening to her and other West Africans telling such stories. And as he did this, he just noticed things about them, and he described her scarification. And you see some modern examples of that now, which many of these accounts give very detailed descriptions of this, and it's people are studying that now, and you can tell who the people were just based on descriptions of the facial and other body markings that they had. This is what Oldendorff writes. Von dieser Nation habe ich zwei Neger und eine Negerin von ihnen gesprochen. Sie haben unzählige kleine Schnitte, teils zwischen den Augen und Ohren, teils auf den Armen und auf den Bauch und Rücken. Sounds like what you're seeing here, right? I spoke with 2 Negroes and 1 Negress from this nation. They have countless small incisions, some between their eyes and ears, and some on their arms, stomach, and back. So imagine what it was like from the perspective of this Tembu woman. After all these terrible things that happened to her, she was ripped from her family in war, had to leave her homeland, the slave ship experience, life enslaved on a plantation in the Caribbean. And now some strange white guy comes and he's speaking a strange new language and he wants you to tell about your life. And that's not something that happens to you every day in slavery, right? So you tell him, and you tell him eagerly, because this guy actually listens with sympathy for you. He really wants to know about you. He just keeps talking to people and he writes it all down in this strange language, German. It probably never happened to her before, and it probably never happened to her again. Yeah. Okay. Now I have some other examples, but I think I'm going to skip them. If you want to hear more later, I can go over that. This is a merchant who was Amina from West Africa. Stephanos, who ended up in Suriname, the Dutch colony in South America. And he ran away and became a Maroon, lived in a Maroon Society and fought in Maroon Wars against Dutch colonial authorities. But I will talk a little bit about Aniaso, who lived on Jamaica. We're moving into the 19th century now. Another Moravian mission called New Carmel in Jamaica. Archibald Monteith was the English name he picked up. Like Wuma, he was Igbo. He was the son of a field worker. As a child, he was kidnapped, put on a slave ship, and taken to Kingston, Jamaica. His detailed account describes the Middle Passage aboard a large slave ship. It's kind of a myth that we only have 1 or 2 examples from African perspectives of what it was like in the actual Middle Passage on the slave ship. In fact, we have about 90 of them in all these languages, and his is one of them. So he was sold in Jamaica to a man named John Monteith. Hence the name that he picked up. Who was a Moravian planter. He took him to the New Carmel plantation, where he worked as a house slave. He received some schooling, and he became a supervisor on the plantation in 1815, still enslaved. In the 1820s, he lived first with 1 and then 4, at least 4 different wives at the same time. And then he converted to and became a Moravian. So that meant you only had 1 wife. After 1826, in 1826, he married a Moravian woman. Okay, so he helped build the church pictured here in New Carmel. It's still there. He became an official and a teacher to other enslaved people, and he purchased his freedom in 1837, which is just 1 year before general emancipation in Jamaica. And he lived another 27 years. So this guy's interesting for a lot of reasons, because on the surface, it seems like he doesn't have that much of a problem with slavery. He's in the Moravian mission, And this is well known among historians. In 1832, there was a huge slave revolt in Jamaica, the Baptist Revolt, it's called. Thousands of people were involved. And the Moravians did not participate. The people who had converted to become Moravians. They just didn't go there, and he didn't either. He describes that. So yeah, this was fodder for pro-slavery defenses of the day when slavery was under attack from the abolition movement. But you read his account in his own voice, and what you see is that he paid to get his freedom. He's self-purchasing, self-emancipation, it's called. And what happened is in the British Empire, they outlawed slavery in 1833, but they said there's going to be a 5-year period. It's called the apprenticeship, where you sort of work your way out of slavery for 5 years. And that was to compensate the planters, the slaveholders. You wouldn't get true freedom and final emancipation in 1838. So in 1833, everybody knew we're going to be free. He didn't want to wait. He paid a lot of money and worked hard to buy his freedom because he wanted to free himself. And while slavery was still existing, he wanted to show everybody that he was free. Now, you're never going to get that perspective unless you look at the African voice, right? So you might, if you're inclined to think that slavery wasn't so bad and people were rigorously defending it at the time, and you say, well, look at these Moravians, they don't even revolt, they're happy. No. They're not going to fight, they're not going to commit suicide in a slave revolt or something. But this guy really wanted to be free, and he just describes that at length. And he did it. And it was just a few months later, so was everybody else. But he was happy for the rest of his life that he invested all that effort and money to achieve that. Okay. Another example is from Cuba. During the dramatic expansion of plantation slavery in Cuba in the early 19th century, the Germans I mentioned before, Franz Hugel Hesse, the diplomat, and then Karl Ritter, published these accounts in German. Let's see. I actually decided not to elaborate on this one to save some time, but just to give you an idea, there were a lot of these accounts of African voices are coming from Cuba. Brazil was underrepresented in my project. I've done better with it than anyone else has, but Cuba is actually overrepresented, which is a good thing, actually. Okay, if you want to hear more about that later, I can go into that. But let's look at Gayfa, Catherine Mulgrave. She was in the Basel Mission in Accra when she gave her account. It's actually incorporated in a letter written in German in 1852 by her husband, Johann Zimmermann. And it was written from Accra to the mission headquarters in Basel, Switzerland. So Gayfa likely learned at least some German, maybe a lot, because she ended up marrying a German. She was kidnapped as a young girl in 1833 on the beach of Luanda in what is now Angola. She was forced on a slave ship and taken to Cuba, but the ship wrecked off the coast of Jamaica, and Gayfa survived and was freed because by then slavery was illegal in the British colonies. She went to first the governor, Mulgrave, and his wife took her and some others into their household, And then she went to the Moravian Mission in Fairfield, where she became a teacher. In 1841, she married a man named George Thompson, who was from Liberia. And he was a member in the Basel Mission on the Gold Coast. And so after they got married, they moved. That's how she got to West Africa. So she was from Angola, goes to Cuba, and then goes to what is now Ghana, West Africa. And they divorced. That's rare in the 1850s, right? But it happened. And she remarried the head of the mission, who was Zimmerman. And he's the one who recorded her life story in German. So consider all these travels and all these things that happened to her, right? How her identity might have developed through all of this. She was from Luanda, Angola, West Central Africa, bound for Cuba on a slave ship. They shipwrecked. She ends up in Jamaica. She becomes a teacher. She marries this Liberian who was raised in Basel. And she goes with him to the Gold Coast mission. They get divorced, and she remarries a German, which is very controversial. Divorce, remarriage. She probably learned at least some German, but who was she? Identity. She remembered her Luandan homeland very well, but she never returned to it. She was clearly part of the African diaspora in the Atlantic world. It's the voice comes from her husband's letter. She tells him all the details of her life. And as far as her identity, what she's thinking, we just have to do our best to try to infer it from that. Who was she? For one, she was most certainly African. And that's something to consider, because for most people, you're not African. In fact, for almost everyone, you have to actually leave Africa to become African. You're from a village, a town, a region, a kingdom, or something. That's where your identity. You don't have a Pan-African identity. That's very modern, very recent. But as soon as you're taken in transatlantic slavery and mixed in with so many other people and encountering all these white people that are doing this to you, you begin to develop something that you can refer to as an African identity. This happened to her. Some might say she's what we call an Atlantic Creole, that is knowledgeable of the situation on both sides of the Atlantic and familiar with different cultures and languages, and play a special role in society because of that. It's hard to figure these things out. But if you look at the African voices, you have a chance. So that's part of my emphasis there, is let them tell you about some of these things, and then you can get at it and maybe get some idea of who they were. Okay. The next I wanted to do Musevo Toki Petro. He was born in the town of Bopont in Angola and spoke Sango. He was kidnapped at age 15, carried to Luanda. He was enslaved 21 years by a Portuguese slave trader. They used him to send other slave ships to Brazil. So this guy ended up working as a slave, as a crew member on slave ships. These are just sort of the things that happen to people. He was freed after his owner's death and moved to Brazil. And he kept working on slave ships for another 6 years. And his slave ship was captured at sea by British warships in 1825, and they took them all to Sierra Leone. He lived in Freetown when Kola interviewed him. Okay. I have one more example, but I think you get the idea. I'll skip that. But that's a nice image of Sierra Leone in the period. Okay, so just some summarizing thoughts about all of this. Without state or empire on either side of the Atlantic, when the slave trade ended in 1867, German became nevertheless the most prominent non-English language for publishing the accounts in 500 African voices. So the so-called slave narrative was not merely an Anglo-American genre shaped by abolitionists. It involved multiple languages throughout the Atlantic world, of which German was the most prominent of the non-English languages. And scientists, missionaries, printers of all sorts and other people participated, not just abolitionists. The point is that German language audiences in Europe and to some degree the Americas were exposed to these African voices and had been ever since the era of slavery and still are. The German language was an important part of the multilingual production and dissemination of these African voices, which circulated then and now much more widely than scholars realize, and they still circulate that way. Africans were learning German, small minority of the total, but German missionaries, scientists, and publishers were out there along with British, Spanish, French, and others acting as mediaries to get these voices out there to get them published. They brought the voices into the Atlantic world for anyone who was interested, both in the era of transatlantic slavery and today. And this large number of African voices testify to the weight of silence and death in the slave system and the immense variety of experiences therein. They're both a great and a terrible resource, and also a powerful rejection of the universal slave owner defense that they had saved people from the horrors of Africa. And they're also a powerful rejection of the modern notion that we cannot better understand African voices due to the dearth of sources, or in fact, the sources are there. So, ich danke Ihnen herzlich. Thank you for listening, and I'll be happy to answer your questions.
All right, we're going to start with questions in the room here, and I'm going to bring the microphone over to anybody that has a question so they'll be able to hear okay. Anybody have any questions in the room before we move to the chat? I have one question.
Okay.
To what extent were interpreters involved in mediating these conversations? Because even somebody like Kurla, there's no way that, I mean, he could have transcribed things, but how could he truly understood what people are saying?
Yeah. If you mean just in the act of recording the account and not the whole process of publishing, there's a lot of mediation involved with that.
Yeah.
With Kurla, I don't know enough about his background, but he was talking to so many different people. He could have at most maybe mastered one or two of probably 50 languages, he accounts. So in that case, they're in Sierra Leone, which is a British colony, and they'd been there for a while. So they were learning English. They were talking to him in English.
I see. Okay.
And he describes, broken English. It was difficult, but there's just no way he's going to learn so many languages. Like I said, it was a kind of a melting pot there. Mm-hmm. For others, if you go to Brazil, well, let me stick to the German example. So Oldendorf with St. Thomas. This guy was extremely intelligent, obviously interested in a lot of languages, and no doubt was learning Dutch Creole and some other languages there. But still, it's a different kind of melting pot, but it's still a melting pot there. And he talked to people from thousands of miles, just of coastline, and then all the interior there. So they we're learning, speaking Dutch Creole to him, maybe some German. And I don't know enough of the details about it, but he would have become conversant in Dutch Creole to talk to him there. And then you do have interpreters sometimes. They described that somebody there who knew the language told me what they were saying. So it's kind of a range of experiences. But if you have the right people like Oldendorp and Köhler, they'll find a way to communicate. That's just one of the things I've learned about languages, and maybe many of you have seen that as well. If you think, well, there's a language barrier, we can't do anything. I think language barriers are really a myth. They're a state of mind. You say, no, I'm going to find a way to talk to this person. You can do it. And remember, if you think about it from their perspective, I mean, you're on a plantation, you're living a life in slavery, and some white guy comes along and he says he just wants to talk to you about your homeland. People were eager to do this. Yeah, and I have an idea, a theory. I've heard people who know more about this tell me that I might be right, but I just haven't worked on it enough to know, is you know, there's storytelling traditions, right? And that's very important in a lot of cultures, including most of these African cultures. And that's how we know so much about the history of enslaved people in this country and a lot of other places. There are oral histories that pass down, and people have a role in the community as storytellers. They're like historians, right? So when somebody like Oldendorp comes around, or Köhler, who do you think is going to be the first one that might go and talk to them? It's somebody who can tell a story and wants to. And you just have a certain connection, empathy, and communication that develops there.
Person.
Yeah, which is not normal in your experience as an enslaved man or woman. Yeah, you're used to dealing with, you know, tension and work, and what if I do something wrong, or how am I going to get out of this godforsaken place, all kinds of things. And there's just something else that's happening here for the people who do it well. And see, these are just the success stories. I have little doubt that there are a lot of other people who weren't very good linguists, who weren't very empathetic with other people's, who maybe tried this and failed and just said, oh, language barrier, forget this. In fact, I know that.
Okay, I'm going to check here. Looks like I can just open the chat, right? Oh, there's nothing in the chat. Okay. Okay, here's a question from Randy.
Do you know, first of all, thank you. Really interesting. But do you know anything about the agenda or the goal that people had interviewing these enslaved people?
Yeah.
Or because I can also imagine the other way around, that people wouldn't trust the white man coming in and asking, because it wasn't always safe to tell your story to white people.
Yeah. You know, I gave you examples of the missionaries, the scientists, abolitionists, and their goals are pretty clear. And if you understand them and you're enslaved, there's nothing threatening there. I mean, it's almost nice and even hopeful with abolitionists. Yeah, oh God, these guys want to get rid of slavery. Well, I don't think I like them. I'll talk to them. I'm trying to think of a scenario where it might seem threatening. And I don't recall running across it. I suppose it was possible. You know, when I studied, this is part of my larger study of immigration, 4 centuries of forced and free transatlantic migrations. And I collect immigrant stories. I talk to somebody, I find out you're an immigrant. I start asking you things, you know, where are you from? When did you come over? What's it like? I just like to do that. And used to do that a lot with taxi drivers in New York and Philadelphia. And then I don't know, 20 years or so ago, I began to realize a stranger in the back of your cab asking questions like that, that could raise suspicion. That could be threatening, even if you're a legal immigrant, but especially if you're an illegal immigrant. So I became a little more cautious about doing that. So there can be scenarios where someone who is empathetic and interested can be threatening you. That's a good question. I hadn't thought about that one, but I haven't run across it. The people you would really worry about were just pro-slavery activists. So in the era of emancipation, the people rigorously defending slavery, and they weren't very good about going and talking to enslaved Black people to find out about that. And the main reason for that is not too many of them are going to tell you that everything's cool. I like slavery. So better off, let me just work with what I think was going on. Slavery is okay. I don't want to talk to them because they might tell me it's not okay. But yeah, I'll have to think about that one. Yeah. Thanks.
Hi, my name's James. Thank you again for a very interesting lecture. I'm from the School of Music. I'm doing my graduate degree in historical musicology. So my question, have you, in cataloging all of these accounts,
Yeah.
have you encountered any sort of narrative or intersection of music or any cultural practice that involves music in these accounts? If yes, like what do you have any examples if you have
Yeah.
encountered some?
Yeah, I have. I didn't get it in the catalog. I had to deal with that. First, let me say what I did include, and that is poetry. You get African voices through poetry, like Phyllis Wheatley, the famous poet in early America, and there are others. There are several examples of that, and sometimes I have poetry in African languages. I think I have a couple of examples of that. And I had to work at wrestle for a long time to decide, what is the criteria? Who should be in this catalog and who should not? And it very quickly became clear that poetry it meets the criteria. So what about music? I had a doctoral student who finished a couple of years ago who worked on the development of voodoo religion in Haiti and New Orleans through the 19th century, kind of a comparative study. And she's really into it. She goes there all the time. She's actually a practitioner. She has family there and things. And she started showing me this music that was coming. It was more Haitian than New Orleans. And she said, well, isn't this it? And it was. I could see the potential for that, but every example I've seen so far is I don't know who produced it. And I'm looking for voices from people who were born free in Africa. And you can see an African connection in the music, but I can't quite tell that it's an African. I wouldn't have to know a name. I have plenty of people whose names I don't know, but I do know that it was an individual that talked to Oldendorf or whomever. And I don't know that with the music. And if I ever find it like that, then I will include it. But there is it somehow a part of it, definitely, but I couldn't quite find a way to make it work with this project now. That's a good question. I don't know enough about who produced the music to be able to say. See, it could have been somebody born on a plantation, enslaved in Haiti, in Saint Domingue, for example. And then they it's more of an African American or Creole voice, which is really important, but not the same as an African voice. And we know linguistically, culturally, spiritually, in all kinds of ways that the African influences were important for Creoles, right? And so it's in their language, it's in their storytelling, it's in their histories, it's in everything, but they're still Creoles, African Americans. And I'm looking for Africans, and I could never, don't have an example yet with music where I could definitively say this is African and not Creole.
Looks like we've got one question here. I'm going to open up. And so I'll just read this out loud for, everybody can read it, but I'll read it out loud anyway. Are the accounts published in German similar to those published in English or Spanish or other languages? Or do you notice a different character to the accounts depending on the language they were published in? Put another way, are German interviewers asking different kinds of questions and therefore getting different kinds of accounts than the English, Spanish, etc.?
Well, I know Philip Modernus. Hello, Philip. He's really good. He's really smart, and he's asking a really interesting, intriguing question there. He's written a lot about German immigration, German immigrants in early America. And the thing I like about his work is he gets the Germans engaged with other people like Native Americans and things. And you see what's going on there. So he does that better than just about anyone I know. So that's the kind of question he would ask. I haven't worked on the German aspect of it long enough to give you a really good answer for that. My knee-jerk reaction is to say what a lot of people who work on this sort of thing involving Germans in the Atlantic world, they'd say, well, they don't have an empire, so they've got a different perspective. They're not like the Spanish or the French or the British, so it's different for them. And there's really something to that. And Oldendorp is on St. Thomas, which is a Danish colony, but the lingua franca is Dutch, and he's German, and he's talking to all these different African people there. I haven't looked closely enough to say definitively. What I see mostly is a distinction in the approach based on what they were, as far as whether they were a missionary or a scientist or an abolitionist or something else. The linguists, and I work with some French linguists, they ask the same kinds of questions that Köhler and Oldendorp ask, for example. They want to know the same kinds of things. And that is, I want to know everything you can tell me, you can remember about your home village. And okay, so you were captured, and who captured you? Well, it was Akan people. And how long did it take you to get to the coast? And what was your route? And how many different peoples did you meet along the way? Tell me everything. What language did you understand the language of your neighbors? Well, the people in the north we could understand, the people in the south we couldn't understand. They would write all that down. The French and Germans were pretty similar as far as that goes. But the missionaries and the abolitionists would ask very different kinds of questions. So that there might be something to maybe the French and Germans had a different approach because they didn't have an empire, but I'd say it's overshadowed by this other distinction based on their profession or their purpose for being there, if you will. That's a good question, though.
All right, I think we're out of time, but thanks so much, Professor Fogleman, for a very interesting talk, and thanks for coming this evening, and all of our friends out in Zoom land also for attending. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.